start quietly sharing the news that the church was going to give up polygamy, George Q. Cannon traveled to Washington, D.C. He had, by the way, a couple of years earlier, served his time in jail after being convicted of cohabitation. Anyways, he goes to Washington, D.C. in early 1890 and stops meeting with the Democrats. That was, I would argue, one of the most important points in the story of Mormons and politics, that George Q. Cannon, when he returns to Washington, D.C., looking for allies, now knowing the church was going to give up polygamy, instead of going back to the Democrats, who he had been working with, and he determined they were feckless and not willing to work with their allies, he meets with the Republicans, and he meets with several prominent operatives within the Republican Party, and they have a series of meetings in the spring and early summer of 1890, where, in the words of one Republican operative that's recorded in George Q. Cannon's diary, they said that if you are willing to switch party alliances, if the Saints were to shift from supporting Democratic principles to Republican principles, it might be an entire new world. We might consider new alliances. Now, let's take a step back and consider this alliance. Now, first and foremost, the Republicans were making it a condition of any potential collaboration that the Latter-day Saints would finally give up polygamy, which is what George Q. Cannon was finally willing to concede. Now, it's clear what the Latter-day Saints would get out of this alliance. They would finally get more recognition, and they were really hoping to be able to achieve statehood for Utah so they could govern themselves rather than being governed as a territory. But what would the Republicans get out of this alliance? Well, you have to remember that in the 1880s, the Republican Party started losing its national stature. It had dominated national politics since the Civil War. But due to accusations of corruption and a resurgent Democratic Party, the Republicans no longer had as firm a grasp over national politics as they used to. And one of the ways that they saw to restoring their grips on national control was forming a political monopoly in the Western territories. Here were all these territories that had been wanting to become states for a long time, including Utah, that were still territories, but if they were transformed into states and had an alliance with the Republican, that would mean 2 more Senate seats from each of those territories, and as well as congressional seats. And so the Republican Party in the late 1880s and 1890s start moving in a coordinated nature to get these territories turned into states and get those states aligned with the Republican Party.